I've got one more thing I'd like to emphasize before we do a recap of what we've studied. Some skeptics tell us that the translations of the Bible that we have are not reliable. And some translations are not reliable. I mean, actually, translations usually are, but there's a lot of copies that are made in the Bible that are not translations as much as they are paraphrases. And those are a lot of times not reliable. And people use them and don't see the difference. And they also find little things, almost all of them nitpicky things, where this word is different than this word, therefore the Bible can't be true because it's been changed too many times. They say that the wording has been changed over the centuries and that what we have today is nothing like whatever the originals were like. I don't know if you've heard that, but I've heard that a lot, and you will hear that in your lifetime if you stay a Christian, which I'm hoping that you do. So keep in mind that the people that make these claims do not believe that the Bible is inspired. Or if they're trying to, they're being fooled by people that don't believe that the Bible is inspired. By inspired, I mean that it's written by a God, not just by men. They can't deny the fact that the Bible has been written down by certain people. They try to change the names, they try to change the time period. But the thing that too many people, probably the vast majority of people, deny is that it was inspired by a God that had it written down in the way that he wanted it written down over the centuries. To make that one long story we talked about the last couple of weeks. But there is a problem with this line of reasoning, I think. If we look at other well-known ancient manuscripts, there are just a few documents that each of them have that we've discovered over the years. We talked last time just briefly about the library at Alexandria, the biggest library in the world. That library was totally lost. Okay, so we don't have copies of thousands and hundreds of thousands of books that were from antiquity like that library. But we do find certain documents that we rely on. This is just a very, very, very few. Okay, I've got Plato's Dialogues, Caesar's Gallic Wars, Tacitus, he actually is one that we've mentioned several times in this class as a reliable source for history type things. We mentioned him just a couple of weeks ago or so when we talked about whether Jesus was a real person, because this one he actually talks about that. And then we've got Herodotus. We actually, in quite a while ago, I don't remember how many weeks, used Herodotus a few times as far as his reliable source to tell us things about that he agreed with that the Bible talked about. But look at how many copies of each one of these that we have. Now, we could list 100 of these books. Some of them would have as many as 50 copies. Some of them would have as many as few as one. But these are some important ones. 7 copies, 10 copies, 2 copies, 8 copies. That's all we have. And it's important to know also that the time span between when these men would have written these books and when we find the first copies of them are usually thousands of years. So for instance, with Plato's Dialogues, we got 7 copies. But look at this. This is important. Plato lived about 400 BC, and that's when he would have written. The first copy is dated at 980. That's a 1,200-year gap between when Plato would have lived and wrote and when we find his first copy. And yet nobody questions the few copies of Plato that we have. Oh, it's been changed over the years and there's no way we can trace it back, so this probably isn't really Plato's work. Nobody says that. Okay? The New Testament, on the other hand, we're going to see a really short video here in a second. The New Testament, on the other hand, was written, there's Jesus at 4 BC to 28 AD. Okay, that's the approximate time period that he lived. Within a couple of years, And the first fragments that we have of the book of John are earlier than the hundreds. In other words, between 25 and 50 years of when it was actually written. And we've got 25,000 copies of the New Testament before the printing press. And in 4 different languages: Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and I can't remember the other one. Doesn't matter. Right? So, it's amazing that this one book, the Bible, has so many copies that have been found, and yet people used that one as the one that they discriminate against, saying that it's been changed. But if you take all of those ancient copies, all of those 25,000 ancient copies, guess what? They agree with each other. And the things that are changed are copy errors. Somebody put 2 letters backwards, or they used a different word that means the same thing. Okay? But for the most part, they are meticulous in their copying. I want you to watch this short video that I think kind of tells a lot about how this is true. This is like 3 minutes or something like that.
Have you ever heard someone claim that the Bible's been through so many changes and so many revisions that we really can't know what the original message was? Let's use some copy paste to illustrate a major problem with that argument. And what we're going to do is look at the manuscript evidence for some ancient writings compared to the manuscript evidence for the New Testament. That is, we're going to be looking at the handwritten copies made before the days of the printing press for each of these works. For example, for Tacitus, he wrote his famous work called the Annals around the year AD 100. And the earliest copy we have for that comes from about 750 years later. So there's a 750-year gap between when it was written and our earliest copy. How many copies do we have? Just 2. So let's put 2 beings in this cup to represent those manuscripts. For Plato's dialogues, there's a 1,200-year gap, and we have just 7 copies. For the history by Herodotus, there's a 1,300-year gap with just 9 copies. And we have 10 copies of Caesar's Gallic Wars after a 900-year gap. Now, very few people question whether we have the original message of these writings, yet they constantly attack the Bible on this point. And yet the manuscript evidence we have for these is so minimal, and the gap between when they were written and when their earliest copies come from is enormous. So what about the New Testament? Well, it was written in the 1st century AD, and the earliest manuscript evidence we have for it comes within 50 years of that time. Now, how many copies do we have? Well, there are nearly 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts, and they average about 450 pages each. Looks like I should use the bigger cup. But you know what? That's just the Greek manuscripts. When we count the other languages like Latin, Coptic, and Armenian, there's another 20,000 manuscripts. As I mentioned earlier, critics and skeptics rarely question whether we have the original message of these writings, and yet they frequently attack the Bible on this point. You know, it really just shows their bias. But when we look at the evidence before us, we see that their arguments really don't amount to a hill of beans.
Don't let anybody ever tell you that the Bible has been changed and there's proof of it. It is not true. Okay? Because if there's that many copies and they all agree and they all go back to within 50 years of when it was originally written, God did that on purpose to make sure that we have overabundant evidence that things haven't changed. Don't get me wrong, there are some things that they question, but they are so few and far between, and they do not change the message of what the Bible is trying to say whatsoever. And that's not even including the Old Testament, which was meticulously copied over and over again ever since the time of the scribes. All right? This is just the New Testament. Any questions on that? Because I think that is extremely important.
So about 6,000 in Greek, 20,000 in the other languages, but those other languages were written around that same time, right? Those
Well,
manuscripts?
Um, the original New Testament was written in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
There were people not that far, and I'd have to look up to remember exactly the dates, but not that far in advance, there were people that were trying already to make copies of it in other languages, because not everybody in the Roman Empire, most people did, but not everybody in the Roman Empire spoke Greek,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And there were some other, so early on, and then when, the Romans spoke Greek and Latin, but later on, as the church became more noted, the Latin was used in the church, and that's when it was translated in Latin. But this is all before 1500. This is all before the printing press. In the printing press, after the printing press, you could have exact copy after exact copy, and there's no way to not have the same thing. We're talking about things that were handwritten and copied for a period of before 100 AD, so let's say 100 AD up to 1500, so for a 1500-year period of time. All right, and out of that 1500-year period of time, between 1400, between 100 and 1500 roughly, there's 20,000, 25,000, 26,000 he's saying copies, and all of them are in agreement. And that is unprecedented. There is no other book in antiquity that has that many copies, hand copies, let alone ones that agree that much. Does that make that help?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay? All right. So what I want to do now is I want to go back and I want to look quickly at some things that we have been talking about to kind of get us in the mindset of what I want to speak about next time. This is one of our first arguments. Who remembers this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? This is the guy, William Paley, back in the 1700s, that made one of the major arguments that says a watch implies a watchmaker. Why is that important to our discussion? Because if a watch can't be made, or as we talked about later, an eye is so sophisticated, or a camera is so sophisticated that it can't happen by accident, then neither can the creation. There has to be a designer behind it. If there is a designer, then it didn't happen by a mindless society. And even Darwin himself agreed with that. Okay? If you remember, it says, I suppose that the eye with all of its, and he goes on to the different things that are going on inside the eye, could have been formed by natural selection. In other words, by accident. Seems, I freely confess, absurd. Okay? He confessed the fact that the things that are intricate, remember, they didn't even know that the cell was that intricate back then, but intricate things, he says, I don't see how it's absurd to think that those things could have happened by accident. So that was on his mind, at least. We talked about the key evolutionary stages that they present us with, all the way from a protocell, single cell organism, all the way up to what we have now, Homo sapien. But what is it that we said they were forgetting and never putting in this? In fact, most of the time, they're only showing us these two, all right? Different stages of the apes translating into the human. That's what we're bombarded with. Although we do go back on some just a little bit farther back. But what happens? What had to have happened before protocells themselves? There had to have been some kind of inert matter that had no mind, no movement. And evolution can't explain that gap. We talked about that quite a little bit. They never go back and say, they say, you came from a monkey. They never go back and say, you came from a rock. Okay? Something that has no mind, has no movement, has no intelligence. And how did they say we get this intelligence, even though they don't tell us that's where it came from? The implication is that came only through chemistry and electricity over time. So eventually that rock started moving, and then finally that rock, through some chemical actions, began to think and do some stuff. And then it evolved into what we see today. I remember the first time I came face to face with that conclusion that it had to be true if evolution was true. I said, I can't believe in evolution knowing that. And when I mention that to people nowadays, they haven't thought about it either. Very few people have. We talked about symbiotic relationships, right? How there are lots of examples where there are two things that depend on each other and they couldn't have evolved separately or they couldn't exist. All right? The dentist fish and the barracuda and some of these other things that are highly unlikely characters. It's the only thing that the barracuda doesn't eat is the dentist fish. Dentist fish has to eat only things that are on the barracuda's teeth. And the barracuda has to have that taken off their teeth or they'll die. Those two fishes didn't accidentally come about. Accidentally. It's not possible. And we got other simple ones like how we get pollination, right? Flowers and bees aren't supposed to have evolved at the same time. They're at different time periods, all right? Some of this stuff is pretty simple. Even the bacteria inside our stomach, or our idea of if vegetation came first, how did vegetation survive when they have to have carbon dioxide? They get carbon dioxide when we go and exhale, all right? And then we talked about the mousetrap and irreducible complexity. Every piece of that mousetrap has to be in place or the mousetrap can't work. So it has to be assembled by an intelligence, not evolve over time. Same thing, I brought in a little two-stroke engine. Same thing with it. Every piece had to be there or it don't work. But then they look at the complexity of a cell and say, well, it's evolved over time. It's like an accident. Even though inside the cell, there's things like the bacteria flagellum, which is a motorboat motor, has all the parts of a physical motorboat motor. Every piece has to be in place or that thing can't swim. And if that thing can't swim, the cell can't survive. The bacteria can't survive. Or the transport system called the kinesin. Same idea. All right, remember some of these arguments? I know that you came in a little later, but are we getting to some you remember? Good. All right, I'm just going quickly through several of these. What do we know about what creates information? Is information ever created by a rock? This is a computer program. We talked a little bit about computer programming. But that is an intelligence behind it. You know, they're talking about robots are going to be able to create robots that are going to be able to think and do AI. Therefore, we're proving evolution. Not really, because you're starting with intelligence. Somebody's writing the original programs. Okay? You're still starting with intelligence. You're not starting from nothing. Those programs didn't write themselves. So we used an illustration like this. If you give a pen to a rock, you get nothing. It takes a mind with a pen to know how to make information. And that there is enormous amounts of information inside one single DNA strand. Where did that information come from? It didn't come from a rock. Right? We looked at aesthetics, beauty in the universe, and how a lot of it is related to each other in such a way it would seem like it would be from a common designer. And the one we picked on is kind of a popular one called the Fibonacci sequence. We have the Fibonacci spiral. We got the Fibonacci numbers in the various numbers of things we find throughout the universe, and it's found everywhere. All right, we mentioned a whole lot of things about aesthetic type things, showing that there must be a common designer. We also look very specifically at the fact that when you take two different species of the same, or two different kinds of the same species, you end up with a different one. So you take an Old English Terrier and an Old English Bulldog, and you end up breeding them and making a pit bull. Or you take two different kind of roses and you make a third kind of rose. But there is no demonstration at all that can even happen, let alone be able to be demonstrated, that shows a dog changing into a cat or a cat changing into a monkey. All right? This is like the Bible says, not like evolution claims. But they are constantly switching the two on people simply because they know they don't have the evidence that the other can happen. All right? We talked a little bit about the peppered moths. We talked about the gaps between the peppered moths were basically part of the book that we mentioned that was Icons of Evolution, things that they still use in books and illustrations that they had proved and know that they're wrong. Okay? And that book, Icons of Evolution, has quite a few of them in there. We also said that if evolution is true, not only should there be single cells and then fish and then on going on and up and up and up, but there should be lots and lots of fossils in between. They don't have the fossils, all right? They claim they do sometimes, but like with Piltdown Man, they know it was a hoax. With, which one's this? Nebraska Man, they based it on a tooth. And they found out that it was the tooth of an extinct pig 1 year after the monkey trial, when they used it to prove evolution so that evolution could be taught in the schools. Even nowadays, Neanderthal man, they know that if they dressed him up in modern clothes, that he looked like any other guy. All right? That he's probably not. In fact, I know he's not. Any kind of in between. He's just a guy. Okay? And these guys probably had some kind of disease that made them a little bit hunched over and that sort of thing. A lot of people think that nowadays. We've got Ramapithecus. They know now that this was nothing more than what's this?
Orangutan?
Orangutan. Yeah. Nothing more than orangutan jaw. Right? Same with Java Man. Right? They found out years later that Java Man was nothing more than a gibbon. This is a famous evolutionary scientist, paleontologist. I fully agree with your comments. Somebody was commenting on his books where he didn't put in any relevant information on transitional forms, on fossils that are in between. I agree with your comments. On the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book, he didn't put any in. He's an evolutionist, but he didn't put them in there. Why? If I knew of any fossils of fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transitions. In other words, what they have done his time and afterwards is they just say, okay, we want a fossil that looks like it's between this and this. Okay, I'll draw you one. He's saying, I refuse to do that. Even though he's an evolutionist. He said, I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to artistic license, would not mislead the reader? In other words, he wasn't going to lie about it, but he still believed in evolution. Like we said before, this is Darwin's tree that starts with the origin of non-life going into single cell and then branching off into all the different kinds. And we said, this is the way the Bible presents it. He made things in their own kind. There's horses, and they breed horses. There's cats, and they breed cats. And there's dogs, and they breed dogs. And there's people, and they breed people. All right? That's what the evidence shows, and that's what the Bible says. And even though some try to say that these kinds of limbs are based on a design sequence, are not based on a design sequence, that one evolved from another to another to another, all that shows is a common designer, not an evolution. And there's nothing they can do to prove to you that this is an evolutionary process. It's impossible. One of the examples they use is, I can't remember how to pronounce this, Tiktaalik, I think it is, all right? And they use him as the in-between going from in the water to crawling up on land. But I showed a slide before where they actually found next to him footprints that show that it couldn't have been. They have a fossilized piece of rock that show footprints rather than what they're trying to say.
So Ted,
Yes.
that means that they found that in, believe that would be 19 years. So
19 years ago? I believe so, yes. It wasn't that long
This
ago.
is 2006, so yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago they found that. Right?
Crazy.
And it's already been shown by a lot of people that that's probably not true. But that's one of the biggest ones they're still using right now. Right? Because it's so new. This one's been around a lot longer than that. This one, I think they found this shortly after Darwin's day. Right? This has been around a long time. And it was half dinosaur, half bird. But any honest paleontologist, and we read quotes by quite a few of them that said, it's a bird. Right? You can take all the fancy language, but at the end of the day, all they're saying is, it's a bird. Right? It's not a dinosaur. It's a bird. We watched a video by Richard Dawkins that shows this sequence here. And to me, all we've got is, remember down here, if you remember, there was like a whole bunch of different possibilities, and there was like 5 or 6 or 7 of them, and nobody agreed what the first one was. A bear, maybe a hippopotamus, or a bunch of different ones. But they all agreed that it went to Pakicetus, Rhodocetus, and Durodon, and then eventually a whale. We had a video of Richard Dawkins, prominent atheist, saying that, look at that, it's pretty easy. This guy's got feet, this guy's got like kind of feet, this guy, and then eventually this guy, and then now they got fins, and they look close enough the same. But what did we find out? We found out that this guy faked the drawings of Rhodocetus, and he was caught in a video saying, yeah, you're right, there really wasn't there. And then later on, they found another fossil of the same thing where it didn't have a flipper tail, it had a tail of a mammal on it. But Richard Dawkins is still using it because it fits his narrative.
Can you go back one slide?
Yep.
Gotcha. Okay.
That is Rhodocetus, which is this one. Yep. And there was one of the other two, I think it was this one that they also have shown that they know it's not an in-between now, it can't be. We got Stephen Jay Gould, another atheist, who says the absence of fossil evidence for intermediate stages between major transitions. In other words, he's saying there's no fossils in between this and this, and then in between fossils between this and this. That lack, indeed, our inability, even our imagination to construct functional intermediates in many cases has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. The guys at the highest levels know that they got a problem. They can't admit it because they don't want to go against their own theory. Right? We said that the so-called gradual table where you start at the top and you go down, 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 you find the simplest at the bottom and the most complex at the top, exists nowhere in the world. Okay? That table exists nowhere. In fact, we have evidence, massive evidence, that there's marine life at the top of the highest mountains. How did it get there? That's still on Mount Everest. Fish. How did it get there? A catastrophe explains this better than gradualism over millions of years. So we've got fish that are like frozen in time eating, and this organism here, I forget what it is, giving birth, stopped, frozen in time, made into a fossil. That didn't happen gradually like they say it would.
So one thing I've heard about this specifically is the reason fossils are found in mountains is because tectonic plates shift and move from the bottom.
During a flood,
But that right there,
yeah,
that's not that.
no.
That's a sudden, instant thing.
And why are there mass graveyards? And why are there very delicate things that are fossilized that should disappear very, very quickly? And why are there trees that go through layer after layer after layer after layer? Every one of those should be millions and millions of years, and yet the tree trunks go through a whole bunch of them. That's not possible. They talk about the Cambrian explosion, which means we don't understand why, but back during the Cambrian, there was all of a sudden a whole bunch of different kinds of fossils. It's because they're in mass graveyards because of the flood. But they refuse to believe that the flood is true. Okay? We talked a little about the Miller experiment that said that they could produce life, but they really couldn't. Okay? The conditions that he put into it were not possible on a beginning Earth. So his experiment didn't work. We talked about the 2,500 different generations of millions and millions of fruit flies over the last 100, 150 years, because fruit flies live and die so quickly. 2,500 generations of fruit flies. What did they get? They get evolution? No, they got deformed fruit flies by adding certain kinds of things to make evolution work. They've never actually gotten a super duper better fruit fly. Same thing is true with Darwin's original finches. All right? He claimed that this must have happened through natural selection over a long period of time, but when a group of scientists, actually a husband and wife, went there in the 1970s to prove his theory, they found that during this particular period of time there was a drought, and that the beak size of these finches grew significantly because the other ones were dying off. Not that there was a new finch being made, but the other ones that were smaller couldn't eat because those particular food supplies were gone. And they projected that, look, those beaks are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. But what happened is, when the drought was gone, the rains came. And then when the rains came, the drought came. And when the drought came, the rains came, and it ended up coming back as a swing curve instead. And sometimes the beaks were a little bigger, sometimes the beaks were a little smaller. But in the end, they all averaged out to be the same, and they weren't evolving. Talk a little about the first and second law of thermodynamics, which is an important law also. That law simply states, these laws simply state that mass and energy cannot be created or destroyed, and things go from, in a closed system, from order to disorder. So here's what we got. This is the ship back in 1906. This is a picture of the same ship that I took that was grounded in 2021. Okay? Things go from better to worse, not from worse to better. The same thing is true of the sun. All right? If the sun had been around, as long as they say it has, it wouldn't have got stronger. The sun would be burned out by now. And we said that the odds of a lot of this stuff happening, according to a very well-known guy in statistics, is that anything over the chance of 1 in 10 to the 50th is something that could never happen. It's an impossibility. And all of these things, each and every one of them, has probabilities that are way higher than that. We talked quite a bit about probabilities in a couple of the classes. So we got quotes. Why do these people continue to believe it? This is one guy. He says, I want atheism to be true. I want atheism to be true. And I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-known people I know are religious believers. He just doesn't want it to be true. This guy says why. We talked about him quite a little bit. Either there was a supernatural creation or there was spontaneous generation. Either things happened by a mind or things happened by inert matter, by chance. There's no third choice. Spontaneous generation was disproved over 100 years ago. The conclusion is that supernatural creation is probably true, but we cannot accept that on philosophical grounds, meaning we don't want to believe there is a God. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life came about by chance. So, what does all this information tell us? What kind of information does it not tell us? None of this information proves anything. It does not prove evolution. It does not prove God exists. It does not prove the Bible. All right? But it is evidence. Instead, it is evidence to be considered which way does that evidence point? And if we decide that it points in the direction of a mind that came first, then we must do more investigation to find out who that mind is. And that's what the second part of this course went into. If you believe in a mind came first, then that matter must have been created from a mind. Does it automatically follow that you are a Christian? And the answer to that is no. So, does it automatically make you believe the Bible is true? No, because there's a lot of people that believe in some kind of God, and they don't believe the Bible is written as an inspired book. Does it even automatically follow that you believe that there is a God as described in the Bible? Inside evidence. The inside evidence that that I talked about, and a lot of this had to do more with the Bible's. What is it in the Bible that shows that it was written not just by men, but that they had hints and clues? And a lot of those hints and clues that they had to do with predictions and prophecies. All right? So, I'm going to skip through some of this. We've got guys that found the Hittites and proved the Bible correct. We've got crossovers of famous kings that we know that are in the Bible and that are mentioned also in other places. Here's another one. This is King Ahaz. We know that King Ahaz is true from the Bible. We also know that we found one of his signet rings. The same thing with Hezekiah. Same thing with Hezekiah's water tunnel that people didn't believe for a long time. The same thing with King Jehu and some of these other ones. Here is one that comes from Nehemiah, and it's almost an exact replication. It's not Nehemiah itself, but it's talking about the same person doing the same job that Nehemiah said that he did. I want to get through this. These are a bunch of other ones. Even David himself, people doubted that he was either even existed, or if he did, that he was a great king. House of David. They found the inscription. It's true. All right. These two guys here make a claim that the Bible points us in the right direction of discoveries that people don't know that think are true, and it happens over and over and over again. In fact, Unger once said that the Old Testament archaeology has rediscovered whole nations, resurrected important people, and in a most astonishing manner has filled in historical gaps. We talked about that as far as the number of people in the Old Testament and historical records. These are lists of people that are in the Bible and are in history. There's bunches of them. People in the New Testament, and they are also in history. This didn't happen in a vacuum, okay? This happened in real life time, and it's verifiable that it did happen. So the Bible is not telling us a false story. List of nations, okay, that the Bible talks about, that we know are true and that are in the Bible. Partial list of cities mentioned in the Bible that we know are true. Partial list of kings that are in the Bible that we know are real people. The Quran, the Vedas, the Book of Buddha, Book of Shinto, none of them have this kind of ability. They just don't. We said that Luke was an extremely important character this way. If you go back and watch some of the other ones, we went into a lot of detail on things that Luke said, and historians rely on Luke. as if he was a historian that knew what he was talking about. We've got example after example after example of that. Here we've got the fact that Luke mentions 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands, no mistakes. Everyone's in very, very close, important detail. We even have ossuary bone boxes that show us certain things about how the people were killed. Notice here, crucifixion was true. This is the foot of a person that was crucified in a Roman cross that was in a bone box. We've got more than one of those now. Okay? Stake still in them. And we said this particular ossuary bone box reads, James, the son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Says it in Aramaic. And it's dated 63 AD, which would be about 30 years after Jesus died, roughly. We've got lots of those. We talked about the medical information, okay, that the Bible talks about not touching dead bodies. If you do, you got to wash your hands, right? Yet there was a lot of places that did not know how to do that and didn't do that. There was bloodletting. Numbers says don't touch a dead corpse. Deuteronomy says do your business going to the bathroom outside of camp because that's nasty, all right? It's something you're not supposed to do. Yet the Egyptians under Moses put donkey dung on their splinters. I wondered why they got lockjaw. How did Moses know that? Even how the earth was depicted as being upheld for centuries and centuries, thousands of years, was not the same as the Bible, which says he hung suspends the earth on nothing in Job chapter 26. So time after time after time, Genesis chapter 1, we've got Herbert Spencer coming up with his book in the late 1800s about the idea that there is time, force, action, space, and matter. And that's exactly how Genesis chapter 1 is stated. In the beginning, time, God, which is a force, created, which is an action, the heavens, which is space, and the earth, which is matter. And then we talked about, I'm just going to run through these real quick. We talked about the various nations that the Bible mentions how they're going to get destroyed, and one by one, every one of them is destroyed exactly the way that the prophet said over time. So there's the Assyrians. There's Tyre. We talked about Tyre. We talked about Egypt. We talked about Edom. All of these different things were going to happen to Edom, which happened. And here's a list of other ones that the Bible talks about. Every one of them actually happened. So, we said that the subject of the Bible is God, the main theme is the Son, and the Bible is specifically about the long, true story of how a holy and righteous God can dwell with an unholy people. And then, at the very end here, we said that it's more like a story, and that everything in the Old Testament points towards this promised seed. It points forward from the Old Testament type to the antitype in the New Testament. Colossians even comes out and says that. Because it, talking about the church, servant according to God's commission, talking about Jesus, that was given to me for you to make the word of God fully known. The mystery. This was a mystery book for so many years. And when Jesus came, the mystery was finally solved. And we know from other ancient books like Josephus and Tacitus and others that Jesus really lived. But what was the most important part? Jesus not only lived, but when he died, he rose from the dead, which is the point of the entire Bible. And I think the point of why everybody else is believing all the other things that we've talked about. That's the most important thing, is that Jesus wasn't a lunatic because he thought he was a deity, but he wasn't. He wasn't a liar. because he knew that he wasn't deity, but he claimed he was. He claimed to be the Son of God, and the only thing that makes sense was that he was the Son of God, and that he rose from the dead. And we have prediction after prediction after prediction from the Old Testament that says that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, last point. Individually, we have repeatedly stated that none of the evidence is proof positive that there is a God and that the Bible is true. But, listen to this carefully. Collectively, as the evidence piles up, it should become more and more obvious that belief in the existence of God is way more reasonable than not believing in God, and it should be rational to acknowledge that the Bible is telling the truth and must have been written by a source other than men. All right? So what we're going to talk about next week is, and that's going to be the last class. How does that simple fact affect our faith? All right? And I think that's important because I don't know about you guys. You guys might not have a problem with this, but when I was your age, I did it because of how people define faith. All right? I'm not going to change their definition, but I am going to add to it something that was never taught to me and I think is true. We're going to talk about that next week, so I hope you're here to hear that final lesson. All right? Any questions? Nathan, you can stop it here. And I'm sorry we went over. I actually had more stuff in there than I thought I did. I probably should have took out a few more, but if you want any of those details, they're all in the past lessons. All right?